During this event, remember to be kind to yourself. Please give yourself permission to take a break or get a drink of water if you need to. If you want to talk to somebody directly, please share that in the chat, and our moderators can help get you connected with help. Right now, we're going to watch our first clip from Facing Suicide. In this excerpt, Fonda, a suicide survivor, attempt survivor, shares her journey and how her relationship with her aunt gave her support in a moment of crisis. That was a clip from the upcoming documentary, Facing Suicide. You know, what I found so powerful about Fonda's clip is how she describes the pain she feels, and then how her aunt was immediately able to sense something was wrong when she wanted to give away her shoe collection. Dr. Myers, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you know someone is at risk. Maybe what are some of the signs? What are some of the things people might be able to watch for?
Absolutely. I think it's important that we talk about the risk factors, the warning signs, and the protective factors when we talk about suicide prevention. And risk factors are the characteristics or conditions that make it more likely, or the conditions are more likely that an individual will develop warning signs for suicide or become suicidal. And what we know from research is about 90% or more of those individuals who are suicidal, who have attempted suicide, have a diagnosed or diagnosable mental illness. And most commonly that's depression or anxiety or an anxiety disorder. And so a health condition is a risk factor. So just because you have a mental illness doesn't mean that you're going to be suicidal, but it means that you're at a higher risk of developing warning signs. The other piece of that is chronic illness, like a chronic health condition, chronic pain, that increases risk. Traumatic brain injury increases risk. The other piece is that easy access to means, lethal means, that increases risk. So the things that we want to look for is then stressors as well. If somebody has a life stressor, divorce, death, financial, any of those big things that happen in an individual's life, that can increase risk. So if you compound all those things together, that can then develop into warning signs, which in the clip, individuals giving away prized possessions, that's a key sign. Change in behavior. Person's not doing the things that they normally do, they normally like to do. They're sleeping too much or sleeping too little. You see those signs of depression. Person's eating too much or not eating enough. You just see that change in behavior. But there are some protective factors that we can put into place, and we'll talk about that I think a little bit later in the discussion. But some of the protective factors would then be taking those means and means restriction or means safety, which means taking and protecting firearms and medications, and getting folks access to resources such as mental health and those types of things. So those are just some of the general warning signs, risk factors, and protective factors.
Yeah, that's a great place to start, Dr. Myers. I think as we continue on, hopefully folks will see through some of the other clips, some of the things that we've been talking about. So, Dr. Hinojos, why do you think it's important to destigmatize the talk about mental health issues or even suicidal ideation? And maybe how do you recommend people even start that conversation?
Yeah, I think it's important because as we saw in the clip, Fonda was suffering in silence. So she said, I'd had these ideas, and it was after a couple of times that then, it became a plan. And so individuals, because of feelings of shame, because of feelings of guilt, maybe worry that they're going to be disappointing their loved ones or their friends, they're feeling this way, but they're not talking about it. And so they might start showing some of those signs that Dr. Myers mentioned, but they may not be verbally saying that. And even if family is maybe picking up, or friends are picking up on some of those signs, sometimes they don't know what to say. And so what happens is no one says anything. And so I think the more that we can talk about it, the more we can normalize that if I'm not feeling good, it's okay to talk to someone about that. It's okay to acknowledge that for myself, and then also to find the resources that I need to keep me safe. And, unfortunately, I think mental health is a stigma in a lot of communities. I don't think it's just in communities of color, but we do see it quite a bit in those communities. And so, again, individuals are afraid to acknowledge that. And I think sometimes there's this idea too, which I think we see in the clip later, that if I talk about it, then I might bring this, I might make it worse, right? Or if I mention it, then, if I notice that behavior in my loved one and I say something, is that going to put an idea in their head? And I think that's, a huge myth, but it's one that I think a lot of communities struggle with, and one that we see, I think, in the Native American community too, of not wanting to bring some of that bad energy, into my life or into the conversation. But again, when no one says anything, I think that's when the likelihood of attempts and completions happens.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And Jennifer, I'm curious, in the video, Fonda talks about there was a move and kind of disconnection, maybe a little bit in the community. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what are helpful ways to reach out and make connections within a community, especially in your work and the part of the state where you're at?
Absolutely. We know that the connections play such an important role in suicide prevention. And there are so many different ways that people can reach out and make those connections with those around them. Whether you're at your kids' school programs or church functions, or even just simply hanging out with your friends, all of us can reach out and make meaningful connections. The other part of that is that those connections play a vital role when anyone who is struggling. It also allows people to know that they are being supported, valued, and seen. And all of those different things continue to help people have that community to reach out to if they are struggling. Additionally, those people are also able to notice when something is different, whether the person is not acting like they normally would. And then hopefully already having those connections allow people to feel comfortable to ask those questions of, are you okay? I've noticed that you're acting differently. What's going on with you? And as Dr. Hunt mentioned a minute ago, we have to start talking about these topics, because by not talking about them, people are scared to say anything. And by continuing that stigma, that's why we're losing people. So take the opportunity to reach out and make those connections with people around you. And don't be afraid to ask someone around you of, hey, I notice you're acting different. What's going on?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jennifer. I think, this is a topic we will, continue to, I think, weave throughout the conversation tonight. And I'm going to move us into our next story, which is actually from Nebraskan Donna Wolf. She's going to talk about her son, Zebulon, who did die by suicide, and how that inspired her to take on an advocacy role in her work and create support systems in her own area. I also wanted to just note that you can continue to put your questions in the chat. We've been seeing those, and we will get to those throughout the rest of the time together tonight. So let's watch this clip with Donna Wolf.
I lost my son Zebulon to suicide March 1st of 2009. He was 18 years old and a senior at Lutheran High Northeast in Norfolk. He was very popular. He was captain of the football team. He did basketball, track, speech, band, drama. He was involved in everything, but my son truly struggled with anxiety his entire life. I did feel truly alone at the time. I was driving 2 hours one way to find a support group in Omaha, Nebraska. And I said, this is ridiculous. I know there's other people that have experienced this. I am the founder of the Northeast Nebraska Suicide Prevention Coalition in Norfolk, Nebraska. And I also am one of the prevention specialists here at the YCIC, the Youth Crisis Intervention Center and Youth Shelter at Winnebago, Nebraska for the Winnebago tribe. I myself am Native American, I'm Santee Sioux. The old belief is that if you talk about suicide, you're bringing that energy to the room. And that's truly not true. The brain is an organ of the body, just like your heart, your liver, and your lungs. So if we can talk about being heart healthy, we can talk about our brain health as well. We don't need to be so scared and fearful about talking about suicide. Our thoughts are always changing all the time. And if we can give a person that is in crisis a little more time to truly think, do I want to live or do I want to die? There is a third option we can keep safe for right now. Lock everything up. Yes, keep watch of them. Keep eyeballs on them at all times. But culturally, we also have a lot of protective factors. So if you are Native American, you are currently struggling, use our culture. Go to your sweats, smudge, do the drumming, truly get in those talking circles and help one another. If you have a family member or friend that is currently struggling, ask for that help and reach out.
Dr. Hinojos, Donna is a member of the Santee Sioux tribe here in Nebraska. I'm curious, in your work on the reservations in Nebraska, how do you experience some of what Donna relates in her clip?
Okay, it just really resonated with me and the things that I see on the reservations. I think that's why it's important that we continue the conversation just even before we get to attempts or we get to completions, and that there's constant outreach and education around topics of mental health, but especially suicide. Sadly, when I first started working on the reservations, there was a cluster of suicides that were happening, and really difficult at that point. And you know, obviously we did, and we had a lot of support from the community that went in and helped provide some education and some support. But I think it's an ongoing conversation, and especially when you're dealing or you're up against some cultural stigmas or some cultural beliefs. And so when Donna talks about, you know, being afraid to talk about these issues because it might bring this negative energy. I mean, you know, when someone is very spiritual and this is a part of their belief system, their identities, it can be hard to challenge that. And so I really liked your suggestions, and something that, you know, we do is bring in those cultural practices, those cultural traditional ways of healing, like smudging, like sweat. I mean, I hear that a lot with the individuals that we work with, and those are their go-tos. That's how they seek some of that comfort when they're feeling overwhelmed. And I think the more we can integrate that, the more that we'll be able to have conversations. But we need to continue to bring those conversations up and having those conversations all of the time so that we can provide that education. And again, I think it's like just normalizing having those conversations with elders, with family, with small children, just so that we don't wait until an incident happens to start that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's the continuation and the ongoing, and just creating a culture that affirms people having conversations is a place to start, and then really tailoring that to, you know, whatever ethnic or cultural identities have those, you know, different aspects that are really important, whether that's their spirituality or tradition or anything else like that. We do have an audience question that was, who can we contact about developing a suicide response plan for our youth organization? I don't know if Dr. Myers or Dr. Hinojos, if you want to answer that.
Well, I think it would be, depending on what region that you're in, I would recommend reaching out to your local behavioral health regional office. Nebraska is broken up into 6 behavioral health regions. And several years ago, the state coalition worked with the state of Nebraska, and we received over the years, several federal grants for suicide prevention. And through that, we worked with the six behavioral health regions across the state, and they all have prevention departments within those regions that work on various prevention pieces within behavioral health, and suicide prevention is one of those. So I would reach out to them and see what they already might have in place, maybe that they've already developed maybe with others. If they don't have the resources, then they can reach out to the other regions and find the resources that are there.
Great tips. We have another audience question, and I'm going to ask Jennifer if you can speak to this. This audience member says, I lost my son in April of 2020. I found that there is no support in my area for suicide loss. I want to change that and feel led to do that. How can I do that? And, with your work with the Southwest Nebraska Loss Team, how does Loss Team provide support after someone has died by suicide? And maybe what other answers you might have for this audience member?
Absolutely. First of all, we're very sorry for your loss. And as someone that kind of felt alone after the loss of my brother, unfortunately, I can relate to that kind of feeling of no resources and struggling alone. That is kind of a unique thing that the loss teams can help with. The local outreach to suicide survivors or loss are made up of people from our communities. And so because the loss teams are made up of those that we already know in our communities, it does help establish those additional bonds with those who may have lost someone. In the immediate aftermath of losing a loved one, the chaos that people feel is very overwhelming and terrifying. The loss teams allow us to be able to offer help and support resources for those that are trying to sort out their loss and trying to kind of figure out what their life looks like afterwards. The team also allows us to offer local resources as well. So no matter what region you happen to be in, the loss teams are able to provide what's local for you in that area. They also are, many of us make up support groups. We also have local resources and have navigated the chaos ourselves. So we then in turn become a resource as well. Having those familiar faces that we know from other activities in our life can help bring a light into the darkness of loss and help those people feel less alone and isolated. The nice thing also about the loss teams is we are able to continue to check in with survivors and continue to offer that support a lot of times after many of the other supports may have left. So as far as creating a support group in your region, wherever you happen to be in Nebraska, I would definitely say reach out to the regions, as Dr. Myers mentioned. Also know that there's probably a lot of other people in your community that are also struggling. And if you're at a place in your grief journey that you can maybe facilitate that support group, we have lots of options and resources that we can help you get that started and continue to offer that safe place for others that have lost someone.
Great ideas, Jen. Thank you very much. I'm going to take us to another clip. But before I do that, I want to make sure to remind everybody we welcome your questions. You can put them in the chat box anytime. Our next story is from Jeremy, a Nebraskan who is also a suicide attempt survivor. And he talks about his struggles with severe depression and how finding the right medication helped with his suicidal ideation.
So when we started our business in 2006, I'm very competitive. I wanted to have more customers, more money, and my focus quickly became in the wrong priorities, the wrong area. So in 2009, my mental health had slowly declined to a point when I mentioned it to my wife that I'm really struggling. I couldn't get out of bed at that point. Didn't want to eat, so I had very little appetite. And so I went to the doctor and he diagnosed me with severe depression. And my first thought was, don't tell anybody, because who's going to hire the crazy landscaper? The doctor put me on a medication, which helped a little bit, I thought. But then after a while, it seemed like it was getting worse again. A week later, I had my first suicide attempt. In 2012, I was still struggling. Went back to my psychiatrist, who I've seen since day one. Told her I'm still not feeling normal. I'm still struggling. I don't want to get out of bed. Something's not right. And she said, there is a new medication out there. Not a lot's known about it at this point, but I think it might work for you. And I said, I'm desperate at this point. I'll try anything. She said, if you're having any more bad thoughts or increased suicidal thoughts or side effects of that, please let me know. And I said, okay. So she put me on that medication. It's an SSRI medication. I didn't realize that at the time. That's a specific type of class of medication, which now we know I'm extremely allergic to. I woke up and I was mad that I'm still here. Like, what do I have to do to end my life? I don't understand what's going on. We packed up our boys in the minivan, drove across the country, and went and got my brain scanned. That's the best money that we've ever spent to get that SPECT imaging. That's a critical turning point in our story because the doctors were able to take the history, the information that they had that we provided to them, combined with the SPECT imaging of what my brain was looking like, what was going on in there, and slightly tweak the medication that I was on at that time. We're firm believers in medication. There's a different medication for everybody, but it does take a specialist, a very specific person to diagnose that and to provide the proper medication to individuals. I'm excited to announce that it's been 6 years since my last suicidal thought in May of this year. I've still had struggles at different times. That empty hole in my chest has come back, but I haven't had any suicidal thoughts. So that's a huge win. I realized if I can help and share our story to help at least one person, it's worth sharing. So we have written 2 books now. The first one kind of documents our journey up until 2015 with depression and faith. We wrote a children's book. We jokingly say ages 1 to 100, and it helps people start a conversation with their family. For those still struggling, the biggest thing to understand is you're not alone. There are so many people that struggle with this, but just keep fighting because it can get better.
In his clip, Jeremy talks about his journey to be able to balance his depression with the help of medication. I'm wondering, Dr. Myers, maybe you can help us contextualize a little bit more and talk about the role that medication can play with counseling, therapy, and other kinds of treatments.
Absolutely. And I think this is a great example of, to let folks know that there is hope, there's help, and there's healing. Mental illness, depression is very treatable. And to know that there is hope and there's resources out there. And that's the whole idea behind our show tonight, is to help folks get connected. And medication isn't always for everybody. And that's what I want folks to understand, is that sometimes individuals say, well, I might have depression. Do I have to take medication? Well, it's between you and your treatment provider. So the first step is to go see somebody to get an actual diagnosis, and then to determine, well, what is your treatment plan? Some individuals respond to therapy alone, and they find a response relatively quickly and feel much better from their depression relatively quickly. However, some individuals do go see a psychiatrist, a mid-level provider, and have medication, and they respond relatively quickly. Some people do both, therapy and medication. And what research shows is that therapy and medication together, individuals find a quicker response. But when it comes to medication, sometimes individuals will see somebody, they prescribe a medication, and that's the right medication. And they might need to work with that provider and find the right dosage and find what works. But in Jeremy's case, as he talked about, he needed to find the right provider and find the right system. And he had to go on, for some further testing. So his case was a little bit unique, whereas in most cases, an individual would not need, to go to those steps. But to know that, but the key point is that yes, you would need to work with your provider and to know to be patient, because you might have to find the right medication or the right medications that work together for you.
And I think you just kind of alluded to some of this, but we have an audience question that's about the SPECT imaging, as far as, is it financially and locally available, and is it maybe something that's needed for most folks who maybe are presenting with conditions with depression and anxiety?
That's a great question, and I would follow up with your medical provider, and like your insurance provider. But as far as, is it needed for most folks? My answer to that is no. I mean, I'm not a medical doctor, but as far as my experience with treating and working with individuals with depression, I've worked with individuals that very few individuals have had to go have a scan to have that completed.
Okay, great, thanks. I think one of the things in Jeremy's clip here also that, they talked about was, again, community and connection, being open with the doctor, having some of those conversations. A lot of times we can sort of take that thing of the doctor knows best. And this is a time where, I think that maybe that's a little bit different, because they just don't know necessarily. There's not always something, you can't see that a wound is still open on the outside. And so that ability to really, verbalize that, or have someone with you when you're talking to a provider, can really be helpful, so that they can see the whole picture with that. Another thing that I think in Jeremy's story really that was helpful was having kind of what we talk about as a safety plan. And that was something he had with his wife. And, Jennifer, I don't know if you can talk a little bit about, safety plans. There's training for things, but in a very, doesn't have to be a mental health practitioner that can help somebody develop a safety plan.
Absolutely. And that's actually one thing that anytime that I speak with someone that may be struggling, I actually strongly suggest creating a safety plan, because anyone can do it. And the nice thing about the safety plan is you can find templates for them anywhere on the internet. They're all over the place. So you can definitely find one that resonates with you and your family and your support group, to be able to find what's going to work best for you. And these can range anything from a couple of phone numbers that you can call at any time that you need to very elaborate plans. And a lot of it depends on kind of where you are in your progression of your mental illness, to how detailed it needs to be. What I always suggest, and what I've seen always suggested, is that the person actively engages in creating that safety plan. It kind of gives you that buy-in, if you will. And it sounds kind of scary, but most of the time it's simply just a list of resources. It's also some situational awareness type things. When I'm feeling like this is what I'm going to do, or these are what I can try and maybe get me into a different frame of mind. And the nice thing about the safety plans is they can be customized for any age, any situation, any area. Anywhere that you are, you can make this work for you. We know that people that are in crisis often cannot think outside of very tunnel vision, so to speak. So having that in writing and accessible for someone that may be at that crisis point is essential for them to be able to have that resource to reach out when they need it.
That's a great point. Yeah, a great point. Thank you for sharing that piece. We had another audience question that's not completely on this topic, but it's super relevant as school has just started again. The question is, I'm an elementary teacher. At what age do we start talking about suicide to our students? I know many of them have lost someone to it. I myself lost my brother and don't know how to explain very much to my younger daughter. How do we bring this up to our youth? And I'll chime in one piece of information I know from my work with AFSP, but I would love to hear from others as well. Within some of the programs in education that AFSP has, they've developed some specific programming geared toward elementary school folks, middle school, teenagers, and college students, The one for elementary students is called Gizmo, and it's really geared more toward mental health in general, and that mental health is health. And it uses this dog to sort of walk young folks through how we can have these conversations about mental health and how it's okay to have those talks. The other ones that are called It's Real for high school students, for teens. It uses a lot of graphics and things like that for that age group. And then It's Real for college students is a program we use on college campuses with real video from real college students that have struggled with suicidal ideation, attempts, depression, anxiety, and it's a facilitated discussion. So I know there's some programming and things like that that are available, and I don't know if my other guests here have anything else they want to share from their knowledge.
Well, I know that one of the things that we've looked at in different venues of suicide prevention is the good behavior game. I know that Denmark, they implemented that throughout their entire system and really saw that decrease suicidal behavior in all their age groups. And that just really helps teach at a very young age, talking about your feelings and behaviors and so forth. And that's, I think, so I think at a young age, it's really important to role model that it's okay to talk about how you're feeling and so forth.
Great.
Can
We're
I
gonna.
follow up on that?
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, I think that, using these tools that you've talked about and that, the curriculum Dr. Myers mentioned, I think are all like crucial to start having some of those conversations at a young age. Because what we know is when they get to adolescence, like that's who they're talking to. They're talking to each other, right? And they're sharing with their friends and their peers how they're feeling. And a lot of times they have a lot more information than we do as adults, even as parents. And so I think at the younger age that we can normalize some of these conversations and identifying how we feel and identifying like behaviors in our friends and those around us, I think then that sets them up for some good tools and some coping skills when they do get to the age where we know that peer group is going to be, crucial and going to be the ones that they really lean on.
Yeah,
That's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point.
And if I could throw just one short little thing in that I've interacted with out here, a lot of times if you try to approach the subject as, especially as a teacher in an education system, I want to do something along the lines of suicide prevention, you may end up, unfortunately, getting a lot of pushback from your administrators. So a way that you can go about that is simply enabling your classroom to be a safe place where people can just simply talk about their feelings and allowing children at a young age to understand what those feelings are and that it's okay to talk about it. And in doing that, it's kind of a roundabout way, but you're doing suicide prevention just simply by doing that. It may not feel like it, but it's all connected. And by allowing them that safe place, you're doing the suicide prevention without having to necessarily label it as suicide prevention and maybe avoid some of that pushback that you may end up as an educator getting, unfortunately.
So I'm going to transition us to the next clip, which actually is with another Nebraskan, Sony Cochran, who is the Nebraska Extension Rural Wellness Team person, and she's certified in QPR as a trainer. She also has personal experience with a family member completing suicide and other family members who have mental health challenges. She also shares her experience about being based in rural Nebraska.
The Rural Family Stress and Wellness Working Group is a collaborative group of a lot of different folks who are really passionate about our rural communities and our families. And they're passionate about all families. It's just that we know there are some unique challenges in rural areas. We have long days for folks that are working off the farm and then come home and work at night with their families and on the farm. And then we're also at the mercy of the prices, what's going on in the world. I grew up in a farm family. My dad and mom would never have talked about what was going on the farm, whether there were challenges. It's a little bit of that stoic stoicness that we have in our rural communities, that Nebraska strong part, that you're not going to share that with your neighbors and your family. Opening the door to these conversations to try and reduce that stigma in our rural communities. It's not easy. QPR stands for question, persuade, refer. And it's a gatekeeper training to help all of us look for those signs and ways we can help someone who may be having some challenges and having a crisis. And it helps us to ask a question if someone might need help and is thinking of suicide, and to refer them to help. One of the myths is if you ask someone if they're thinking about suicide or ending their life, that will put their thought into their head. And that is not true. It is a myth. And most people, when you ask that question, if you're concerned about someone, will actually be relieved that there's someone they might be able to talk to, or someone has brought it up and they're not keeping that inside. So we always encourage everyone, offer hope, ask the question.
Sonia's clip really underscores that people who live in rural areas, they have a different level of access to support resources and perhaps a different perspective about overall wellness. Jennifer, I'm wondering, this is something you have a lot of experience with being in North Platte. Through your various roles, what's your approach to community building and resources that maybe others could learn from?
Absolutely. And as Sonia indicated, the rural areas do kind of operate on a different mindset. We're used to taking care of things ourselves out here, and often taking care of things within our own families. Oftentimes, unfortunately, that's why it's so difficult to get people talking. We know that so many people in the rural hotlines kind of came out of that same mindset of knowing what we're going through and how we're dealing with it. We also see a lot of the peer-to-peer support systems working really well out in these types of areas, simply because it's people that are living the same struggles, fighting the same battles, and feeling the pressures of continuing the family livelihoods and all of that comes into play when you're out in a rural area. And by tapping into these strong mindsets that make the people who live out here and work in our areas, we can help change the way that people view reaching out for help. A lot of the times we can utilize that hard working principles to encourage people to stick with working through their struggles, and recognize that it does take a whole village to not only raise our children, but also allow people to get help through various different methods, just as they would get help with raising their crops or their livestock. And so oftentimes we have to utilize all of those different connections through the peer-to-peer supports or the rural crisis hotlines, and utilize some of those church youth groups or church organizations and such to be able to get people to open up to the fact that they are struggling, and then be open to exploring options to make them or to help them get into a better mindset and tap into that hardy mindset that we have out.
That's a great, point from the perspective of where you're coming from. Dr. Hinojos, I'm wondering about, from your perspective, thinking about rural access on the reservation, maybe at the tribal college. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think for us, like Jennifer said, partnerships have been key. So partnering with elders in the community, partnering with some of the more spiritual community members that individuals look up to. Absolutely partnering with the schools and the colleges, because they're hearing firsthand. That's who the students are going to. That's who families are going to way before they get to us. And we build trust that way. If they see that these individuals in the community that they have trust in are saying, you should, go and talk with Belinda, or you should go and see Morningstar. And I think that helps bridge some of that like stigma, some of that worry of, being judged, or, not feeling like this is a safe thing to do or an okay thing to do. So I know partnerships have been key for us. And then also, one of the things we do is that we try to be present at events that are not just mental health events, right? Or not just about suicide prevention. And so I think the more we're immersed in the community, because it is such a small community, rural community, like the reservations, people know who's who and who's around and who's not. And so I think kind of being a safe space at powwows or at other events, then, kind of again builds that trust for them to come and seek us when it might be more difficult to do so.
That's a great point there. I, kind of connected to this in a different way. We were talking about sort of that isolation in rural parts of the state. And those of us maybe that live more on the eastern part of the state haven't had to deal with isolation that way. But over the last couple of years, we have, even though there maybe are more resources in the community. And I know there have been several audience questions connected to how we've seen COVID impact folks and isolation and loneliness. And Dr. Myers, I'm wondering if you can, expand a little bit about what you've seen in your work and, how people have been able to garner some support during these really difficult last couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And COVID, obviously has, because that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to isolate to stay safe. But with mental illness and helping ourselves, we're supposed to connect with others. And Jennifer touched on that. And that's a very key point that I want folks to hopefully take away. I want folks to take away from tonight is that connectedness is really one of the key protective factors. Connectedness to family, friends, school. So when we leave today and we say, well, what can I do to help prevent suicide in our community? What can we do to help promote connectedness within our communities? And what COVID has done is it's pushed us into more isolation, but it also has helped us look at how can we, within that isolation, look at more creative ways to find ways to connect with others. And so that has opened up through technology, through really through technology, but really hitting home the point that it's important to check on people. And that was really a key point during COVID, is that, you really need to check on your family, your friends, your loved ones. And that's a key point during suicide prevention. That's what we're talking about. Ask the question, are you thinking of suicide? Are you okay? It's okay to ask that question. That's what's important during COVID, just checking on people. Are you doing okay? And what we've seen through COVID is we've seen an increase of individuals seeking out resources because the isolation has exacerbated their symptoms that they were already experiencing of depression and anxiety. But we've seen an increase of folks accessing telehealth, accessing resources through support groups, online support groups, and those types of things.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting when we talk about the technology piece, if there's something that positive that maybe has come out of this time where we've been in is it's normalized a little bit and maybe reduced some of that stigma of being able to have that conversation, because so many of us experienced that in ways maybe we hadn't before. And so it's broadened the ability to have conversations in places maybe we didn't in the past. I was talking to somebody who works in the northeast part of the state, and they were talking about how telehealth has really helped reduce some of the stigma, or at least help seeking, because it gives them that ability to connect with somebody without their truck being outside the counselor's office, or some other way that feels very identifying to them in a way that they're not quite ready for. And so I thought that was a really interesting perspective as well.
Yeah.
So
kind of strange as that may seem, we see that a lot in the smaller communities, people being afraid to reach out for help simply because, everybody knows that Bob drives that truck and, oh my gosh, Bob is out at the counseling office. What's he doing there? Or Bob was at the doctor. Is everything okay? And I think the other thing that's worth talking about with the COVID era and all of the things that have come out of that is I think it's also allowing a lot of those people that have been isolated because of that anxiety or any of those depression factors a little bit more access to reach out for that, where maybe before it wasn't either as known or as available, even though maybe you may be new to the mental health world. For those that maybe were already suffering and weren't able to go out to a counselor's office, it maybe opened up some new avenues for them as well.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So I'm going to share our final clip that we're going to show today. And this is from the documentary Facing Suicide. In this clip, Greg, who was a member of the championship Arley Warriors basketball team, talks about his personal struggles with suicidal ideation. If you're not familiar with the Arley Warriors, they have quite an amazing story, and we recommend the article that Sadie put in the chat about them. Their team was really quite inspired hope in that community while there were multiple suicides happening in Montana's Flathead Indian Reservation at that time. That's our last clip from Facing Suicide, but before we get to some more audience questions, I thought it might be worth all of us just sharing a little bit about, our what resonated for us, with that clip. I've seen it a couple of times now, and the part that really stuck out for me was this idea of the contagion of hope. And, that we, in the work we do in suicide prevention, a lot of times we talk about contagion, and this is why we don't talk about maybe how somebody died. We're very mindful about how we want to communicate things with our media. This is why there was a lot of talk a few years ago about the reasons why that was on Netflix because of the contagion and impact. But I really, it resonated when they talked about this contagion of hope. And that also can be infectious when you think of something being contagious. And I don't know if anybody else had anything that resonated for them that they want to share before we get to some more audience questions.
Well, I think the thing of the contagion of hope and the contagion of connectedness is important, and the peer-to-peer, that we've talked about earlier. And one of the things that the state suicide prevention developed that we released earlier this year it's called the My Companion app, and it's a phone app it's available on the Google Play and the Apple Play Store, and it's geared towards 15 to 24-year-olds. And as I watched this, it made me think of and I think of like a basketball team and kids connecting with each other. And it's a journaling app. And, I know we have teachers and administrators and folks listening in, but it's meant for kids to go in and download this app and to go in and journal about how their day's going. And if they meet somebody during the day, they can go in and type in who that person is, how to contact them. But then it also connects directly to the Boys Town National Hotline, that if they ever are suicidal, they can get connected right away. And it's modeled after the Utah app that they had, and it's just a resource. And that's what made me think about it, is that it's another resource to try to help promote that peer-to-peer connection.
That's great. And Dr. Hinojos, I was thinking of what you talked about earlier about how having that conversation when our folks are young in elementary school, because who do they talk to? And I think this clip with Greg and Darshan was an excellent example of that. Maybe can you talk a little bit about how you've seen that in your work with peers?
Yeah. I mean, that's one thing that really stayed with me is, thank goodness his friends acted, right? Thank goodness they went and reached out to him and contacted his mom and didn't, dismiss it or but I'm the mom of an 18-year-old. So it is terrifying, that there could be things going on with my child and they're not sharing with me, and they're not a child, they're 18. And so I know, like, from the parent perspective, like that's scary to know that we, as much as we want to support them and help them, we're not who they're going to. And so I think that's, why it's so important to normalize these conversations in schools. And so, Jennifer talked about, like, that pushback that you might get from administrators, but I know as an educator, and, that's maybe a tough, role to take on, especially depending on your administrator, your district. But I think it's one that hopefully there's, like, support out there. I know there's always strength in numbers to really advocate for these services and having these conversations in schools at a very young age. So we're not just building up individual coping skills, but we're building them. We're giving them tools that they can utilize later when, they are their friend's counselor. They are the person that their friend is going to, and so that their friends have the tools to be able then to go to adults, to go to parents or teachers or counselors, to be able to provide additional supports because that's a lot for a young person to also take on, right? For their friend to be confiding in them with some pretty heavy things sometimes. And so we want to make sure that everyone feels supported, whether you're the person that needs the support or whether the person that maybe is the people are coming to you, and you're having to provide that.
I think that's a great space when we talk about taking care of ourselves and taking care of the folks around us. And if we're tending to our own sort of mental health garden, there's two things that happen with that. It keeps us healthy, so then we can also be that resource for other people. And it's also sort of setting an example. And I think that's a piece as the adults. We have an opportunity really to model some of that for our kids or our students or anybody else. And there was an audience question in here that I thought was really interesting, where it was the perspective of someone who had experienced this when they were in high school and maybe in middle school of, there being some deaths in their schools and feeling like it was a bit maybe robotic or like a script and not so sincere as it was discussed. And is there a way that we can do this a little more sincerely or authentically? And the thing that struck me with that is that's a hard ask for teachers and school administrators too, because that may or may not be something that is comfortable for us to talk about as adults. And when we have people who are looking to us for answers, it can be really uncomfortable. And so I think as we're talking tonight about having those conversations, and it's okay to talk about it, it's also okay to not always have all of the answers, and that's okay too. And it's really that ability to connect with people and say, let's find those answers together. And we really want to be able to provide, as suicide prevention folks, we want to be able to provide those resources to our communities in a variety of settings so that they feel like, we're all in this together. It's not just in the home. It's not just in the schools. We're having a lot more conversations, I know, in the workplaces, and they're offering more things through, whether it's their EAPs or just things that they have available for conversations and opening up the dialogue about, it being okay to not be okay. So yeah, I think that all of that connects.
And Sunny, I'm sorry. And Sunny talked about, and to go off what you're saying, Jennifer, is that, in the trainings that we're seeing in the workplace, I'm seeing more QPR trainings in the workplace and just in the communities. And that's something that was our goal. And that, when we brought QPR to Nebraska, and so Sunny, talked about being a QPR trainer. And so there are QPR trainers across the state. And so I just want folks to know that if you're interested in QPR trainer, it's another thing to reach out to your behavioral health region and say, who's a QPR trainer within our region. And, most regions will provide that training or will get you connected to a QPR trainer. So that you can have that training. But if you don't, you don't have to be trained to, it's good to be trained, But like in the video clip that we just saw, you know, the friends jumped right in and were right there, and that was very courageous. And that's what we want to see happen. And if somebody says that, hey, I'm suicidal, you know, we need to take action. We need to be there for that person. Even if we don't know what to do, then it's important that we pick up the phone and we call 988, the National Suicide Helpline, and say, hey, I'm with somebody. What steps do I take? And they will help you take the next steps, and don't leave that person alone.
Yeah, I think we maybe have time for one more question before we wrap up for today. And this is from another audience member here. And they're talking about having mixed feelings of not being a survivor themselves, or having ever attempted, and not having lost anybody close, but they want to continue to be a support and share a message, even though they can't connect in a personal way. And so I might share a little bit about myself in that, where in the work that I have done with suicide prevention as a volunteer, I'm very much in the minority, where thankfully I've not had a personal loss to suicide. But my husband is a veteran, and he's lost somebody from his unit. And both of my girls, who are in their 20s now, lost classmates to suicide. And so what I saw was the ripple that has with the people who are the survivors. And I don't think that you have to have been an attempt survivor to be able to be compassionate and empathetic and listen, when really that is, you know, just so imperative. We've spent a lot of time tonight talking about that connectedness, and that's something that we can all do, because when someone is feeling suicidal, they're so isolated and lonely, at least internally, that's how it feels. And so being that person who can reach out, can have that conversation is critical. So I wouldn't dissuade anybody from engaging in these kinds of activities and conversations, and being able to connect with folks, because it's the talking that really, you know, helps save lives.
And if I could just jump in very quickly, just be authentic. Don't be afraid to say, I may not have lost somebody, but I still am sorry that you have. And by saying that you still care, that is enough to show someone that they're loved and make that connection. So as long as you're being authentic and coming from a good place, you don't have to have been through the loss to be able to provide support.
So I would say get involved. And if you're passionate about it, get involved. I would go to the Nebraska State Coalition website. We have a list of all the active coalitions across the state that we're aware of that have websites, and that you can click on and get information for suicide prevention efforts within your local areas across Nebraska.
Great, thank you. Gosh, this was really, I think a good conversation that doesn't end at the end of this broadcast, for sure. I just want to thank all of our panelists again for joining us for this discussion. Dr. Belinda Hinojos of Morningstar Counseling, Jennifer Krajewski of Southwest Nebraska Lost Teams and AFSP, and Dr. Dave Myers of Bryan Health. We also want to thank Donna Wolf and Jeremy Koch and Sony Cochran for sharing their Nebraska stories with us. Big thanks to Margie Prop for providing the ASL interpretation. I'm Jennifer Sparrock, and I work at Nebraska Medicine and the board chair-elect for the Nebraska chapter of AFSP. Thank you so much for joining us today for this preview of Facing Suicide. I got the opportunity to see parts of it, and I highly recommend it. The full documentary premieres on Tuesday, September 13th at 8 p.m. Central Time on Nebraska Public Media. If you're looking for more information or resources, you can visit nebraskapublicmedia.org/mental health to learn more. We want to thank you all